Now to introduce our first spotlight session of the day, please welcome partner at Lewis, Brisbois, Bisgard & Smith, David Nahai.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let's have a bit of a rousing good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. I think we'll have some more coffee served at the tables, perhaps. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Nahai, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to make an introduction. But before doing that, I want to tell you about something you may not know about. I want to tell you about an app for pregnant women, which tells a woman about the progress of her baby during the pregnancy. And when my daughter became pregnant, she got this app. And one day she came to us and she said to me, she said, "Dad, my baby is now the size of a blueberry." Size of a blueberry. And ever since then, for us, this name, the blueberry, stuck. And in the bloom of time, the blueberry grew, and last Saturday, at precisely 12:50 a.m., on November 19th, the blueberry came into the world as Ella. Thank you. And I heard, of course, Ella's first cries, and they gave her to me, and I held her in the crook of my arm. And I tried to process the flood of emotions that was washing over me. And beyond love, beyond joy, I felt thankful. Thankful that my daughter and her husband had good health care coverage so that Ella could receive the best care and was born in one of the best hospitals in the world. Thankful that she was born to parents who love one another, who have a stable home. Thankful that she was born to a family that had the financial wherewithal to educate her, protect her, shelter her. And as I was feeling these feelings, I all of a sudden thought about all of those other little blueberries, those other little girls that were born also at precisely 12:50 a.m. on Saturday, November 19th, 2019, who do not have the same blessings, the same good fortune as Ella has. And I thought, what happens to those little girls? Will they, at some point, end up adding to the 60,000 souls who will sleep on our streets tonight? Because we, you, me, haven't provided an adequate safety net for them. And I know that this will be a recurring theme throughout the day today. But today is a day when we really must think what each of us can do more to deal with this symptom of this breakdown in our society that enables this calamity to take place on our streets every night. You know, it feels like what was once this noble war on poverty has turned into a war on the poor, a war on the sick. And I hear people say, oh, you know, homelessness has always been with us. That's not acceptable. How's that okay? So I hope that today we will all put our thoughts together about this. You, me, government officials, but also the private sector. And this is what I want to just talk about in order to introduce the next speaker. Corporate America. It's always been thought that corporate America has got its first obligations to its shareholders, to its investors, and that's where things stop. But that's changing. That thinking is changing. Just a few months ago, 180 CEOs of US companies got together and they put out a statement of purpose. And that statement of purpose says that it is the responsibility of corporate America to go beyond providing a decent return to shareholders, to do something for all of society, and that is good business. It's good for the image of the company. It's good for attracting employees. It's good for making investors feel good about their association with the company. And right at the front of that pack is America's largest bank, JP Chase. And today, I am so happy to be able to introduce the distinguished representative of that company with us here today, because he, both personally and as a representative of JP Chase, does so much in the field of social responsibility. His name is Barry Simmons, and he is the Managing Director and California Divisional Director for Consumer Banking and Wealth Management at Chase. He came to LA in 2008. He's specialized in wealth management, enterprise and community engagement. He leads Chase's initiatives to give back to the Black community. He oversees 1,000 branches, and he's greatly expanded JP Morgan's free community programs, focusing on financial literacy, career development, and youth mentorship. And thanks to the support of JP Chase, LABC has been leading on efforts to strengthen workforce development, spur economic development, and increase opportunities for small and diverse businesses. So, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Barry Simmons.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate those kind words, and it's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Good morning to everyone, and on behalf of all of my colleagues here with me from JP Chase, we're thrilled to serve as the sponsor for this year's Mayoral Transportation Jobs Summit. We're also honored, as I look across the room, to call so many of you our partners, but also our friends. We all have a big part in helping our communities write the next chapter of our story. But yet we still remain stuck in a world where opportunities for people of color remain out of reach. This persists despite numerous studies that give us all the evidence that shows us what we need. We know that diversity is good for business and the economy. We know that when people of color are fully involved in all aspects of society, we get better economic outcomes for our communities. This should serve as a wake-up call for all of us and anyone in leadership, especially for those of us who work and live here in California. Considering this, our state's homeless crisis affects African Americans disproportionately more than any other group. While African Americans make up 10% of the state's population, we account for nearly 40% of the state's homeless population. The only way that we're going to tackle this issue is to embrace diversity, that both the public and the private sectors truly represent everyone, especially the most impacted in those communities. Today, we now operate in an environment where we need people who think differently, who bring different backgrounds and experiences, and approach problems from different angles. Because of this, diversity ultimately forms the backbone of innovation and really focusing on us in this time of uncertainty and change, how we can make a difference. And at JP Chase, I'm very proud to say that we are on our own journey in addressing this. In April, we announced a new initiative called Advancing Black Pathways. This new initiative will create opportunity and help improve financial health for Black Americans. The program addresses 3 areas: education, careers, and wealth. Across all 3 areas, there exists persistent racial and economic disparities that create barriers for the long-term financial success of Black Americans. We also have created an internal program called Advancing Black Leaders. This is a strategy that's focused on attracting and hiring and advancing black talent across all levels of the organization in corporate America in our firm. As the largest financial institution, as you heard David say, in the country, we have a responsibility to address these issues head on. In fact, if we don't, the uncertainty that's afflicting so many and the fellow citizens, particularly black Americans living here in California, will only persist. So it's our responsibility to tackle it. By supporting our communities, we're creating opportunities for black Americans where it may not have existed before. I really want to show you the essence of what we talk about and what we mean with the Advancing Black Pathways initiative. So in order to do that, I want to play a quick, short clip that captures the program's potential.
Our story is your story, and it's still being written. We're drafting the narrative and pushing boundaries. Together, we are advancing Black Pathways.
We're not even remotely close to parity. It's time that we kind of roll up our sleeves and do it and make it succeed.
JP Morgan Chase put together a council to really focus on 3 areas of concern for black people in this country.
Wealth, education, and careers are actually intertwined. They have to be considered simultaneously.
The one thing about wealth creation is not you win, I lose, or vice versa. The pie can be bigger, and the thing is, does everyone have the opportunity to participate?
We're making sure the economy works for everyone. By igniting ongoing dialogue with 20,000 women across the country on how to achieve financial success.
The best financial decision I've made is understanding my worth.
And making sure financial education starts young.
As a person that came up with nothing, and there was a bunch of people just like me that didn't ask, didn't know, didn't care.
My mind didn't allow me to think long term because nobody around me thought that way.
We've launched the Apprentice Program and Financial Services Institute to give students financial education, training, and access to career opportunities. We're also teaming up with Howard University to teach freshmen about their financial journey. And the Startup Bus, a boot camp on wheels growing the next generation of black technologists and entrepreneurs.
If you can get the resources to minority small businesses, the power they can have in driving economic growth and in driving job creation.
This is about jobs. This is about new opportunities. This is about spurring local growth.
Whether it's black entrepreneurs, whether it's students, we're going to use our resources so everyone has an opportunity to succeed.
Our company's got to reflect our communities, it's got to reflect our customers, and honestly, it's just the right thing to do.
We're investing in education, careers, and wealth. We're investing in you.
I'm very excited that we're confronting this issue head on, and calling it Black Pathways, right? It's like we're talking about black people who are very clear.
This is Advancing Black Pathways.
I hope you can see, as I know all of my colleagues at JP Morgan Chase, we're extremely proud of Advancing Black Pathways and its potential. It truly gives us tremendous purpose and momentum, and it's led at the top of the house with Jamie Dimon at the forefront, and we're all rallied behind him and absolutely proud of it. We've since rolled out a broader $125 million 5-year investment in financial health in order to create economic opportunity for black households. As part of this, in July, we announced a new partnership with the National Urban League with a $1.5 million commitment to launch the new FinTech Savings Initiative, integrating our FinTech tools into the Urban League's existing financial coaching programs for black Americans across the country. In August, we were also the 28th organization ever to be inducted into the $1 Billion Roundtable, a significant recognition for thank you very much, thank you, a significant recognition for U.S.-based corporations that spend over $1 billion or more annually on diverse suppliers, including companies owned and operated by people of color, women, military veterans, and people with disabilities. In 2018 alone, we spent over $2 billion with diverse suppliers. And so far, through the first 3 quarters of 2019, we've approved over 170 small business administration loans in Los Angeles, totaling nearly $50 million for small businesses predominantly owned by minorities. Thank you. Finally, as folks are all aware, we know that Los Angeles is entering the next decade, and it will receive an unprecedented amount of investment in our infrastructure. Over the next few years, the region will host one of the largest world sports and entertainment events, all leading up to the Olympics in 2028. Because of this and these incoming regional investments, JP Morgan Chase has made a grant last year to Los Angeles Business Council Institute. This grant will allow us to explore different strategies to connect diverse and small businesses closely with these procurement opportunities. The 2020s, as we all know, offers us a lifetime of us to create more equitable business opportunities in LA, and we need to do this together. To close, I just want to say all of us in the room, I know we want to help people of color achieve their long-term goals, their dreams like home ownership, small business investment, retirement savings for college. But to do this, we need to make sure that we provide the right conditions to ensure lasting solutions. Embracing diversity is the only way that we can stay relevant and succeed in today's fast-changing environment. And while there's much more to diversity than just the color of people's skin, we all know that that still remains a large part of the equation. Just having one person of color in a room can be the difference between introducing a new idea or a service and a new product. While we face unprecedented problems at scale across the state, I know I still remain hopeful, and I hope all of you do for our future. Because as Californians, we know no problem is too big for us all to solve together. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your summit.
Taking the stage next is today's second panel, Collaborative Solutions to Homelessness. Brad Cox, chair of the LABC Institute, will serve as the panel moderator.
Lost my group. I'm going to talk for 90 minutes, so I've got a speech here prepared for everybody. I know you came to hear me, you didn't want to hear any of these people. How's everyone doing this morning? I must say, I think I have the pleasure of moderating what's going to be the best panel today. So we've got a small group of people here that have no opinions, no ideas, no thoughts, and are not afraid are always afraid to share their thoughts. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing the people, but as you know, to my left is Supervisor Catherine Barger from the County of Los Angeles, Sarah Dussault, who is the chair of Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LASA, Rob Jernigan, co-managing regional managing principal for Gensler in the Southwest region, Chris Coe, now Managing Director of Homeless Initiatives at the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, Ann Sewell, Vice President, Health and Housing, California Community Foundation, and last, my good friend Doug Schumacher, who is the President of Mercy Housing of California. So as David Nahai pointed out, Los Angeles, we really are in an emergency humanitarian crisis. This year's homeless count found nearly 59,000 people are experiencing homelessness in the county and nearly 36,000 in the city of Los Angeles. The shocking part is that from 2013 to 2018, the number of deaths from homeless individuals has really doubled. We had over 1,000 people dying in our streets, over 3 per day, which is just shocking for where we are in the city. While we received record funding from the state, we've had funded measures HH and HHH. Our solutions really haven't matched the scale of the problem. Today we're going to have a dialogue around really 3 issues. We're going to talk about sheltering, we'll talk about housing, and then we'll talk about services, which really creates a great opportunity. And as we know, homelessness, it's an age-old problem, but what's happened in Los Angeles and really over the entire state of California, that this problem has accelerated far beyond what any of us had anticipated. And it's just overwhelming us. And so part of the task today is recognizing where we are, How do we provide the scale of resources? How do we respond to some of these challenges and issues? And how do we provide the short-term and long-term solutions to really deal with these issues? And it's something we could spend all day talking about with this panel, because they all have phenomenal ideas and they're all outstanding leaders in working towards those solutions. But today we're going to just focus in on those three areas that I talked about. And I like to start with really sheltering, which is our most immediate need, and reducing, what are the strategies that are really out there that we are seeing that are successful, and what are the changes that we need to make relative to rapid deployment to ensure that we pull people off the street. We had the LA Times, Los Angeles Business Council Institute poll that came out with UCLA that was very evident that, our citizens of Los Angeles County want us to respond, and they want us to come up with solutions to this problem. So I'm going to start with the supervisor. You're rapidly deploying shelter facilities throughout the county in your leadership role. You're also working very hard in your district to address those problems. What are the touch points you found that's successful? What are the challenges that you're facing? And how do you see that, how do we work harder to solve this?
Well, and a good question. And first of all, I do talk about this all day, because this is the number one issue on people's minds. Their frustration, they're angry, they feel like nothing is being done. And there is no question that there's a challenge as it relates to where we put these shelters. Truthfully, it's been probably the most difficult thing to site emergency shelters. But I look at cities like Santa Clarita, who, working with the city, the county, and the community, we've been able to build shelter housing that's had the complete support of the community, even to the point of where each night members of the community are serving meals and making dinners for the homeless population. So it can be done, but it takes patience, but it also takes education. And I look to my city, Pasadena, who actually did not have a growth in homelessness, and in part because they spent money in educating the community about who these homeless individuals are. And they are already in the community, and if left to their own device, are in fact impacting quality of life. So it's better to invest in shelter, and it has not been easy with Pasadena, but they've done it. They've taken a leadership role. And what I tell people is, we've got the money. So money is not our problem. The problem is having a political will to say, we are going to do it, and we're going to take the time to work with the community. And my aha moment was, I think we overthink how to go about doing that. LA County, unincorporated area, is truly what the Board of Supervisors oversees as it relates to housing. About 20,000 estimated homeless in the unincorporated area. LA City, which is truly ground zero for this issue, far greater number. I look to Bellflower, who now is saying, we will handle every single homeless person that either lives from family in our community. They entered into a court decree with Orange County, believe it or not, over it. They have taken ownership. That is what we are now going to do with our cities. In the 5th District, I'm hoping throughout the county, working with the private sector, because government is not good at building housing. The private sector is. So on Tuesday, Janice Hahn and I are bringing in a motion that is going to take it to the next level and say, counties out, private sector in, we are going to site, we are going to provide additional resources. Measure H does not have any money like HHH for housing. We are going to explore where we can set aside money, and we are going to let the private sector lead with not a one-size-fits-all, but in fact really housing that is going to be modeled to the community, working with the cities. So it's a challenge, but again, I say money's not our problem, leadership is.
That's a great comment. And Sarah, you run as chair of the board of LAHSA, which is the largest service agency, and I think you've expressed at times the same comment that the supervisor made. Who's in charge, and how do we really implement and bring the services that we have within our toolkit out to the street? And what's your thought on how we attack this and what changes we need to be made to the system to be more effective?
Well, I think some of the recommendations around the housing side also need to be brought to the homeless services side. So we have two jobs. We need to, street to home, we need to house people. And the second job is we need a home for them to go to, whether it's an emergency home, whether it's a shelter. So those two there's two sides to that. And throughout, and a piece of the home also is prevention. A piece of the home also is preservation of affordable housing. So in that, what I am concerned about is continually to look at the flow chart and say, who can be taken out of this chart? Who can be doubled up? How can we make clear lines of accountability so that instead of it being everyone's problem, it's clear who's tackling which part and how those lines of accountability relate then to individual cities. So we've seen, and the supervisor just mentioned several cities that are really stepping up. There are many others. Pomona built a 16,000 square foot sprung structure for over 200 individuals. They were one of the first. I don't know if anyone from Pomona's here, but congratulations, great job. So there are a variety of cities. Los Angeles, the mayor's Bridge Home program, he's building hundreds, now almost thousands of beds. So that is an immediate response. But this emergency is more than that. It's a fixture of our economy in terms of our wage inequality, in terms of access to mental health care, access to health care. So we've got to be looking at both the short term and an immediate reaction, but we also have to look at the long term. And I think the only way to do that is to continually refine our structure and to continually look for systems innovations that eliminate steps and create clear lines of accountability.
Yeah, and that's a challenge. It's interesting, and Rob at Ginsler, I know they've been working very closely with both the city and the county in trying to figure out how we can deploy emergency shelter alternatives in different manners, different ways, and on a much faster timeline. It's interesting that you've had the conversation with my partner at Trammell Crow, who was 8 years as a Naval Academy officer in the Seabees. And, the Seabees in 48 hours can put up 2,000 sprung shelters to accommodate the soldiers in the armed forces. And here in Los Angeles, it takes us, the one that we just put up in Skid Row was 2 years to get up. So, what are some of the thoughts and things that you're exploring as to how we deal with that issue?
Well, Brad, I think myself, like most people in the room, sort of woke up one day and we said, how did we get here? And then we looked to the city and the county and we said, what are you doing? And then my partner in crime, Lou Horn, and I looked over at each other and said, why are we just looking to the city and the county? Don't we have a role? Doesn't everybody in this room have a role? So we said, let's get together and let's go tackle this thing. So 2 years ago, we had our interns get together, and CBRE identified 550 sites, and we created templates that can go on any one of these sites so that we can actually walk up and say, this is how many people, and this is the cost to put these people on the sites, and we can do it quickly, and we can move quickly, okay? But then the right issue is, how do you find that person with the political will to move this? And Supervisor Barger came to us, and she says, I'm that person. Let's sit down with my people, let's go through these sites, and let's move quickly. And that's what we have to do, and this is the leadership that we respect so much, and that's what we're gonna do. No offense, we did El Pueblo, and as Brad said, a year later, Hollywood opened. This is too big, it's growing too fast, it's about speed, and it's about repetition, and it's about getting the costs down so that we can afford to solve this problem. And that's what the private sector is going to do with the public sector.
And that's a great comment, Rob, and it goes back as you have the supervisor who has the political will to say, I'm going to put these shelters in my community. And Chris, going to you, you've been out there ground zero in Koreatown and trying to get the community to buy into shelters. And share your thoughts on how we do a better job of engaging the community, because we get substantial pushback from communities for bringing these shelters into their local neighborhoods.
Yeah, good morning. I think there's two parts to that question of how do we view shelters and how do communities view them. I think for us, we view shelters as an integral part of the system, and we need more of them to get to the gap that Lassa identified. What it means to be part of the system, though, means that it's important we look at who gets in, where they go after, and what the experience is while they're inside. I think those are critical questions beyond just the building. In terms of where they go after they get inside, that's why the mayor, when they talk about the bridge home, it is about a bridge to something else. I think in New York, we talk a lot about the fact that they have the shelters, but we don't talk about the fact that there is a 5-year voucher waiting for anyone who makes under $23,000. Anyone gets that. If you make more than $23,000, everyone gets a one-time 1-year amount of rent. So they have a place to go afterwards, which makes it substantially different. That means without that, who gets in is a critical part of the question, either someone who can make it out on their own or who is on their pathway to the next step. And then the experience while they're inside, I have this phone. It's a BlackBerry. Imagine I'm one of the only people in this room that has it. And the reason is that there's the hardware, there is also the software. The reason no one else has this phone is the software part of it is so critical. The experience of what is a dignified experience while people are inside is critical. Those 3 things is the difference between one shelter doing one shelter's amount of work. One shelter can do 2, 3, or 4 shelters amount of work. You can build 100 beds and have it house 200, 300, 400 people, or just the 100 people. And I think in Koreatown, I think a challenge for us in Los Angeles, Koreatown was interesting because it also has a cultural context of the LA riots. That was part of that civil unrest context. There's a lot wound up in it, and I think every community we go into has a cultural, historical context. But what is common, and what was common in Koreatown, is when we talk about building something, everyone is mentally thinking about Skid Row. Skid Row represents less than 10% of our homeless population. It represents 90% of our mental headspace when we think about it. So when we talk about building anything, every community is thinking we are bringing Skid Row to you. And we have to remember that Skid Row, you're talking about 1,500, 2,000 shelter beds in a 1-block radius there. That's 20 times what we're talking about, the scale of what we're building here. So distinguishing between what we're talking about, I think, was critical. In terms of fear, there's the message, but there's also the messenger. I can talk about crime all day long. It matters more and is more impactful when a police officer talks about crime. I can talk about home value all day long. A real estate broker talking about home value is more important. So I think those are all important things to keep in mind.
We're going to come back to the discussion about services. I think that's a critical component of the sheltering experience and how we transition it. Ann, share with us, you were part of the HHH committee, and we raised over $1 billion, and it was really targeted to permanent housing. One of the challenges is the supervisor said we have money. The taxpayers have committed substantial money. How do we balance what goes into affordable, what goes into permanent supportive, what goes into the transitional sheltering experience, and how do those buckets of money work, and where should we be allocating and prioritizing the money we have available? Because as Jonathan pointed out this morning in his presentation, this is a $40 billion problem. It's not a $1 billion problem.
40 billion.
Sure. So measure HHH, which everybody who voted for it, raise your hand. 79% of us voted for it across the county, or across the city, I mean. It was very specifically targeted to help the city of Los Angeles go from 300 supportive housing units a year to 1,000 for 10 years. It was intended to build 7,000 extra units over what the city, with very limited resources, was able to do. And it was based on 20 years worth of experience of what works to house people who are experiencing homelessness, who need services to successfully stay housed and stabilize. The description of what it could be used for was permanent supportive housing and a little bit of shelter. But its companion piece, which we forget about sometimes because it came a few months later in March of 2017, was Measure H, which is a sales tax, roughly $360 million a year, that could be used to do anything in the county's comprehensive homeless plan, including different kinds of shelter, different kinds of housing. And so we really need to think of those things together. that HHH, which is now fully allocated for not just 7,000 units, but 8,600 units, and it will reach its goals ahead of schedule. By 2025, we will have those 10,000 units fully built out. And yet we always knew when we are good at math. We actually, housing developers, housing advocates can do math really well. We knew that 10,000 supportive housing units would not solve a 50,000 person problem. We always knew it was the down payment. It was the beginning of what we hoped would be more to come when we successfully could show that we had built those units. But Measure H is equally important, and it runs out, in the same period of time. And we need to think about it as the source for not only services, but flexibility and emergency shelter and those other things that we need for the whole system that everybody's describing. It's not just one thing.
And Doug, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but Supervisor, the county has committed a lot of money and resources to just what Ian described. And where do you see the opportunity? And should it be, how do we balance for sheltering, permanent supportive and affordable, and the financial commitments, and how do we prioritize those buckets?
Well, if you look at HHH, Measure H was designed to complement what HHH is doing as it relates to services. But in the Antelope Valley, I'm going up next week to dedicate a project, Kensington, which is going to have emergency, transitional, and permanent all on one campus. I think that we need to not be so sold on, first of all, shelter is not a bad word, but in communities, to your point, when they hear shelter, they think of Skid Row, and you're bringing these people into my community that are already there. I think we need to be flexible, and I don't want to get tied to any one specific, because it's not that way in LA County. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I think that's really where I get frustrated, is we get so hung up on emergency shelter. Arcadia, rather than building an emergency shelter, is taking hotel vouchers and using the motels and hotels to house the homeless in their community. I think we need to be flexible. We need to empower cities to be our partner versus be restrictive and say, here's how you can use this money, here's how you can't. I think my cities are frustrated because it's like, you're telling us you want to work with us, but yet you're telling us you're not going to work with us. You can't either give us some money and let us do our job, or stop complaining. And, I think I really don't want to get caught up in transitional versus permanent. I think they all serve a purpose.
And so, Doug, Mercy Housing is in Sacramento, you're in Northern California, you're in Southern California. We go back to this, should we deploy a centralized command center to make decisions, lead this effort so that we have more of a coordinated effort, because there's a lot of good ideas, a lot of implementation of those great ideas, but maybe that's not transferring and filtering across. Are you finding the Northern California, Sacramento, dealing with it differently than what we're experiencing here and in San Diego?
I think there are bits and pieces of success everywhere. I don't actually think there's anywhere in the state where you could sit there and say, these people have nailed it, they've got the command and control that you're describing, Brad. I think part of what makes it really hard is that the only thing people hate more than homelessness are the solutions to it. And so, to the supervisor's point, everywhere you go, I find people throwing up reasons why this strategy or this other strategy isn't acceptable at this moment in time. And so I think as you pointed out and others have pointed out, we're not going to solve this problem at the speed with which the public will support us over time if we don't sort of toss out some of the things that are sacred to us or seemingly sacred to us. So we think we got to move on that a little bit harder. And honestly, we're not scaling our effort at the size of the problem. So I think, every mayor that I speak to, without naming names, is justifiably worried that if they're a champion of the solutions, say permanent supportive housing or whatever it is, but the public experiences whether or not we're solving homelessness by what they see on the street. And that's the reality politically that we all need to face. So I think the answer that I would suspect almost everyone on this panel would say is we literally cannot have a shelter versus permanent housing strategy. That makes no sense to anyone. We have to do both, and we have to do a few more things that are upstream of it, right? We're rushing to the scene of the fire, which is critically important. We have tens of thousands of homeless people on the street, and yet every day, and Sarah, I'm sure you know these numbers better than I do, twice as many people are made homeless as we're getting off the street, and we have almost nothing deployed on that prevention side. So I think the reality is we say we're serious about this, but the scale with which we're attacking it suggests that we're really not. We gotta double, triple, or quadruple down almost everywhere in the state. And I think there are a lot of things that are happening well in Los Angeles. I think to your point, they're not happening well everywhere in LA, just like they're not happening everywhere else in the state. And we're sort of bouncing around hoping that little bits and pieces add up to something bigger, and the reality is I don't think they are yet.
So Ann, how would you respond to that? We have this trying to marry services with housing, whether that's sheltering or permanent, supportive or affordable. It's a matter of, we have this concept of, do people really have, if they go into sheltering, do they have to, mandatory requirements to enter into, whether it's job training, drug counseling if it's appropriate, that they have rules and regulations that they have to meet. And then there's that other side of the equation that says if you're going into transitional housing, it's live and let live, so to speak, that we can't require people to enter into these mandatory programs. What's your thought on how we bridge that gap to move people from off the street, those that want to get off the street, into housing?
The late Molly Lowry used to have an expression that most of us have picked up, which is whatever it takes for as long as it takes. I think we need to be super pragmatic. If it takes having sort of a tolerance for some behaviors, just as, you can go into your own home and eat and drink whatever you like, then there should be opportunities to entice people into an environment where they will stay housed in that. If it takes people feeling safe to have an abstinent place, then we should have that. I think one of the problems that we have both in the, and I have to say I'm not, a shelter expert, short of, cooking meals for people at them with my church. That's my whole experience. But it seems like one of the problems we have with shelters, and we're seeing it reflected somewhat in supportive housing, is that we have kind of a one-size-fits-all, and that's not the way, our homeless brothers and sisters, come to us. So some people, for instance, coming into supportive housing, they need more than a case manager that they share among 19 other people and some 12-step programs every week. Some people need actual help with the activities of daily living. They're getting older. They need a board and care with, stricter rules, all the way to, to a locked facility. So we don't really, we have starved that other part of the service delivery system even more than we've starved the supportive housing. And one of the things I'm hopeful about this year, I just did a list of the headwinds and tailwinds for my board, and on the tailwind side, there were not very many things. One of them was our export of Dr. Mark Galley from LA County to be the head of Health and Human Services at the state. And he's really thinking about how do we have more flexibility in the Medi-Cal program to support the higher level of services, whether it's in shelters or in supportive housing, because we need to be more nuanced in how we're providing those services to keep people successful.
Sarah, you're obviously front and center at LASA on the streets.
So I was just going to add a couple points. So I love, there's a phrase at DMH, nothing about us without us. And that has driven some of the work at the LASA Commission. So I want to recognize my fellow commissioner, Jacqueline Wagner, who's here, who led, she gets a shout out. Besides her day job at Enterprise, she led an effort focused on Black persons experiencing homelessness, and specifically recommendations around what works for people from people's voices. So I think that's really critical. If we're calling this a humanitarian crisis, that means that it's human, and we have to be talking to people and figuring out what it is, what's it going to take? What do you need? How do we get to these solutions? And I think Commissioner Gruhl was here earlier. So Wendy Gruhl, I'd also like to recognize. So she and I, along with I think several others here, worked on the ad hoc report on women. And so that work around some really specific needs of populations drives solutions that have been really effective. So you can have a larger shelter site that works for individuals. You can have shared housing that works for families. We have smaller sites that's working for women only. And I think that is really important, that we keep thinking about and talking to and hearing from voices of people experiencing what's happening right now.
And Doug, to stitch it back to your question about Koreatown, to even explain why we started creating low barrier shelters in the first place, it was to offer choice to people, to help people come inside. So in the Koreatown debate, there was often a desire for two things. One, we want people off our streets. Actually, three things. Two, we would like there to be no drug and alcohol use in the shelter. Three, we don't want people coming from anywhere else. And I was explaining that you can't have the second and third together necessarily, because if I were to ask you, how many of you all have had a drink in the last 90 days in your home? So there are some shelters you would not be welcome in, right? So we created low barrier.
The other 20% aren't telling the truth.
That's true. So the reason for that was to offer choice, because a lot of people have chosen to stay outside, given a lot of things. So to have places for people to choose to come inside where they are safely taking the next steps, I think is important. Now, what has been said about having an additional choice for people who want to be in a sober environment is also important. So I think it's important to remember why we even got to this place in the first time and what it actually allows for in terms of the community needs. So when I kept asking Koreatown, would you rather have people off the street from your community, knowing that some of them may be struggling with these issues, they were more willing to understand that.
And Supervisor, you balance that as you allocate funding and how you guys support really the health services for the County of Los Angeles. What are your thoughts on how we attack that issue?
Well, first of all, I'm still mad at the state for taking Mark Galley, but at least I know I've got an ally up at the state. Mark actually handled a portion of health services in our jails for us down here in LA County, and his wife still continues to be our director of health services. And I share Mark's vision as it relates to how we go about providing support and services in the community. I am in support of housing first and not mandating that they have to abide by rules in order to be clean coming in, but there are rules once they come in, and they have to abide by those rules. I think you have to have structure. And I remember when I started with the county, who remembers SROs? Yeah, those were very popular around Skid Row. And it was you had a bed, a toilet, and a sink, and then you had common areas downstairs. Those models for a lot of the individuals that are service resistant and have been on the street a long time are the type of models you want in place, because you want a sense of community, because they will become isolated, and you need to, for lack of a better word, retrain them in terms of structure and do's and don'ts. But if you say you have to be clean, you have to be sober, you have to take mental health services, they're going to decline housing. So I think we need to recognize that a lot of these individuals have been on the street for 20, 30 years, and we have to be able to accommodate the fact that they are not going to conform immediately. But that doesn't mean you do a live and let live. I was frustrated with the LA Times article where they outlined where these people that have been put into housing that were being so disruptive, because it tells me that we are failing with Measure H, because the whole purpose behind Measure H is to provide the supportive services to ensure that what is happening in those apartments doesn't happen. And that's where you get the community pushback when we try to place people in permanent housing using Measure H dollars or using Section 8, because their fear is that these are going to be people that are going to disrupt.
They are. Let's go. Doug, you had a thought.
I just wanted to say two things, and I don't know how they exactly relate, but I'm going to throw them out there. One is, what I experienced, like Chris mentioned, is that we think of the homeless population in terms of this chronic, mentally ill, substance abusing population, and that's not my experience of the vast majority of people that are experiencing homelessness, but it is the public's imagination of it. And I think, I have a colleague up in the Bay Area who runs the Benioff Center for Homelessness at UCSF, and Dr. Margot Cushell, incredible, read her research if you haven't. She did this study of homelessness in Alameda County among people over the age of 50. And it turned out that I think about 45% of the people that were homeless in Alameda County, Oakland, et cetera, had never been homeless before the age of 50. So this totally blows apart what we think the homeless population is, right? We have this image of the Vietnam vet who's been on the street for 30 years. The reality is, by everyone I understand, is more than half of the people that end up with these deep mental health issues and substance abuse problems get them because of homelessness. It's not the cause of their homelessness. And so the consequence of us not dealing with this at the scale that we need to is that we're actually making the solution much more expensive. And so I think that's something we just have to keep in mind. We're imagining we have to all deal with the chronic issue at its greatest peak. If we were doing much more upstream and dealing with the prevention and the rapid rehousing, our problems would get smaller over time. So,
absolutely.
Let's move to a more positive subject. Let's talk about housing and how do we produce more housing. We can talk forever on this specific challenge and how we really solve it. It's frustrating because the poll that came out, it really showed that citizens are frustrated with the solutions that are out there. I mean, you take us as an example. We built a $165 million project right across from the historic Old Pueblo. We had the first transitional bridge housing program that Ginzler designed and built, put on. The homeless situation we had before the transitional bridge housing was built is the same today as it was before. So we invest all this money, 20% affordable, no public subsidy. So as a commercial property owner or as a citizen paying taxes, I feel that we've spent all this money in these programs and we've seen no result in our specific neighborhood. And the result, we have the challenge renting apartments because tenants won't go out at nighttime because of the homeless situation that's still there after all this money's been spent. So that's what our poll showed as well, that there's this frustration that we have lots of ideas and we're trying to get to answers. We're trying to implement programs, but it's not changing the problem, and we're only having an increase. And I agree with you, Doug, that it is a lack of affordable housing, and for the majority of the McKinsey shows over 1 million people here that are one paycheck away from being out on the street. So that's the frustration, and I don't think we have any answers unless somebody has a real clear, concise answer other than what I've heard here is we need to have a more focused, consolidated leadership effort because people like you are doing phenomenal things. But, do we create this mobility command center? Do we do like the armed forces do in emergency, like what we did when we have FEMA, when we have an earthquake? We've got a consolidated command center that can make decisions, that can override rules and regulations, override policies to really implement solutions to the problem. And I throw that out for a discussion before I move into the long-term solution.
So, Brad, I would jump in because I moved to Los Angeles in 1978 to attend graduate school at UCLA. And the only homeless people you saw were if you went down to Skid Row. I mean, the first time I saw somebody sleeping on the street at the Ralph's at the corner of Bundy and Wilshire, I stopped and stared. I could not imagine what was going on. So this, we talk about it's an age-old problem. It is not actually older than I am in Los Angeles. And the difference, I think, is that in that same year, across the county, we permitted 80,000 multifamily units. And last year, across LA County, which was a banner year for us, we permitted 19,000 multifamily units, 75% of which were in the city of Los Angeles. So I think partly when we're talking about the immediate problem of homelessness, there is a command and control issue. But I think there is a huge upstream housing production issue that we don't need a really big, I mean, in 1978, people just went to their planning department, got their permits, built, et cetera. And we've just made it so much more difficult with all the anti-growth, NIMBY, Prop U, sorry, I'm still blaming Xavier Luskin, can't get over it. But, I think we've just really made things much harder than they need to be. And if we were to find a way to open that spigot, not irresponsibly, not like let's just build $4,000 a month units, but intentionally, as we're doing with the city's transit-oriented communities ordinance, as you've built a lot of, where you get affordable and market rate at the same time, we would see a lot of that upstream problem, and then we could use our command and control, Navy SEALs or whatever, to come in and deal with the need to have people off the street in a more humane way quickly. But I think we're conflating the two problems. So.
Well, and I agree, Ann. I think the big issue...
About Zeb or everything?
How do we... Just Zeb.
This is UCLA. Zeb may be out there. No.
But to build our way out of this, it's not a short-term problem. It's a long-term problem. And so, again, instead of calling it interim housing, it needs to be immediate housing. Because I also agree with Doug, is our issue is only going to get worse the longer we leave more and more and more people out there. Okay, everybody, Michael Bonin said, when did the conversations change about little Sally? And the conversation changed with Sally, the 14-year-old girl that lived on the street. After 5 years, she was a very, very different girl. And we left her out there. And we have the ability to build immediate housing quickly and get them off the streets. And right now, that's more important than anything. And yes, I'm a big proponent of bump beds. Let's get more people in. Let's get them off the streets. Let's move quickly. Then let's change the laws. Then let's try to correct this supply problem. We have a huge supply problem. But if we wait for the permanent housing, we're going to have a lot of acutely ill people.
Well, I love that word, immediate housing, because I think shelter is often a synonym for quick and cheap and easy. Right. I think that's what people really mean when we say we want shelter. I think we're saying we want a place for people to come inside quickly and safely. And I think some of the options are not only shelter to do that. So I think this class of things we can do quickly, if we were to be more imaginative about it, I think it would help, because there are master leasing options that are quicker than shelter. There are more and more, this price per square foot on modular shared housing is intersecting with shelter. So I think if we had this conversation about immediate housing, I think it would be fantastic. And to be super clear, though, to put a number behind Doug's point, the inflow, the crisis is this crisis. The real crisis is the tsunami every day. We are having a fire every single day. 150 people a day are entering into homelessness. That we would have to keep up, we'd have to build 2 shelters a day, right? So, like, we haven't, yeah, I appreciate that. But, I mean, that's the scale we're talking about. We can shelter all the 60,000 people tomorrow, and then we would still have the 150 people a day. So to be clear, every country that's ended homelessness, every place, when you look at Finland, other places, they're doing the same thing we did, but they didn't have the 150 people a day coming on.
Yeah. I have to take a Zen pill right now because, there is legislation that Santiago passed that exempts CEQA from the city, county, certain agencies. So obviously we all agree that CEQA is one of the problems, and CEQA reform needs to be looked at. It's no secret that the county is now considering doing an arts fee, which, by the way, I love arts, and I want to get arts out into the communities. But is now the time to put a 1% tax on affordable or on housing to fund the arts? And for me, government needs to get out of the way. So when you talk about immediate housing, this makes my blood boil. And I know that as a supervisor who has approved housing in my district and gets criticized all the time, the reality is that there is a calling for housing. Otherwise, these developers, some of who are in the room, wouldn't be building housing out in my district. But yet, we get criticized and the cost goes up. I mean, on one housing project, took 25 years to get it approved.
Right.
25 years. And I think about 25 years?
Yes.
Yeah, 25 years. And now the one that we approved isn't going to be in court as well. So, I hear immediate housing, and I'm all for it. But if the homeless issue is what's going to push government to take a look at how we are going about approving projects, then, I'm going to embrace it, because this is yeah. I mean, it is the most frustrating experience, and I heard someone say before I came up on stage that they want to expand Santiago's legislation because it only addresses LA County, LA City, parks, our community development, real specific. But that tells me that everyone knows that it is problematic. And by the way, CEQA was envisioned for a good reason, but it's now been used to impede development.
It is. We adjudicate every project on a project-by-project basis. That doesn't work. It's just not untenable. We'll never deliver any inventory, never meet our inventory needs under that.
So, you know, everybody agrees this is a big problem. But the process isn't scaled to fit the problem. Doug nailed it. At the end of the day, we're not going to build ourselves out of this 50 units at a time. We're not going to have to issue X amount of RFPs and X amount of this and X amount of this. We need to scale this thing up big. We need to look at it very differently. I will compliment Sarah. We teamed up with Flyway Homes, and we came in and we said, 800 beds, 800 days, we'll get it done. Let's scale this thing up. Ultimately, it's about repetition. It's about reaching out to the other partners. And there's plenty of you, plenty of manufacturers in the community who reach out to us regularly and say, how can we help? Can we give you flooring? Can we give you appliances? Can we give you these things? But if we're looking at it at 50 units, they're not going to want to play. But if we can scale this up to where we can start to say, yes, give me 1,000, give me 2,000 sets of appliances, give me this, boom, we can solve this thing. And I think the other issue that Sarah also led us to, we've been tackling this from a single occupancy point of view. And we came in from an aspect of shared, 2-bedroom, 2-bath. And yes, the service providers will operate that. That enabled us to take it from 400,000 to 600,000. And Catherine said, we have a lot of money. We don't have enough money for $600,000 for all these units. And we were able to get this down to 150,000. Now that, between 100 to 150, I think we would all agree, that's reasonable, that makes sense, that we can afford. And that's the method we have to go. But it's that cost because of scale, not onesie-twosie.
Sarah, you had a thought you were going to share.
Well, I would just make 2 points, kind of overriding themes. One is back to where Ann was talking about in terms of our zoning practices. So just on a more macro policy level, we went from, redlining is bad, we can't possibly redline, but zoning and downzoning is really the new redlining. And regulations, not done well, is really creating structural racism, but also structural income inequality. And I just think we need to think about it on a more macro scale, because you're right, onesie-twosie is not going to work, but that means freeing up some larger policy issues. The other point I do want to make to the nostalgic late 1970s is that also was the time when we deinstitutionalized mental institutions. And I just speak from this from a very personal point of view. I've shared publicly many times, my brother is both homeless and mentally ill, and the last couple of weeks have been in particular challenging because he was found again, and I had the opportunity to work with DMH and DHS to have him declared incompetent. He was, of course, yet arrested again. He's been arrested this year probably 20 times. So as I'm sitting yet again all day in court, because it's not a 1-hour affair, for him to be declared incompetent, I am sitting there steaming mad that he is this sick and so angry that we haven't done more to prevent people from getting this sick. I don't know what's going to happen next. I was able, luckily, to visit him in jail. He's going to wait at least a month in jail before he's placed in a hospital, because that's how long it takes. So he's, sitting, waiting for me to talk to him, handcuffed to the table. And he says, it was his birthday, and I said, I really wish I could have had a cake and candles. They don't let you take anything in. And he said, I haven't had that in so long. Do you think I had that last? I think I was 21, right? He's 44. I think I was 21. And I was like, no, it was maybe 24. So it is a failure on all our parts. And I just want to be clear about that urgency, and that's what drives me personally. But I just think it's really important for all of us to think about the humanity in each and every person that's experiencing homelessness, and to go at this humbly. I don't know that I have all the answers. In fact, I'm very clear I don't. But I think we have to constantly be questioning the systems we're putting in place and the efficiency and decisions we made in the past that maybe weren't so great, and ways that we can do better, because there's someone's brother, mother, sister, friend at stake here,
Everyone.
and we have to do more.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well said, Sarah. The goal. We need to break the mold. We need to break the mold. And Ann, I want to go to you. Just as part of the HHH program, as the last tranche of the HHH, you really put out this challenge to come up with some innovative solutions to try to, again, how do we drive down costs? How do we be more efficient in building permanent and affordable housing? And I know I'll have Doug commented on as well, because I know they're doing some modular project as well. So how do we get there? What did you learn out of that experience in that last phase?
So as I said before, HHH was designed to build the kinds of things that we have tested for the last 20 years that we know work. And I think one of the challenges with the innovation challenge was to keep the pieces that we know work. Sarah talks about the failure. One of the reasons we closed the mental hospitals was we had new drugs, and we probably tested them for a year and said, oh, these are great. People can do well out in the street if they just take. We didn't give it enough time to learn that was a cycle that wouldn't necessarily work. And so we've learned what works in terms of supportive housing, and so we tried to keep those elements even into the innovation things. So some of the pieces that are, I sort of divided into really innovative, kind of medium innovative, and we're just kind of testing this to see what works innovative. But it was driven in part by frustration that things cost so much. And for the record, please, it is not costing $500,000 a unit in public money to build an HHH project. It's costing $150,000 in HHH money. So just to be clear, it's not all that. So I think one of the tricks is, how do we build something that's going to last, that's going to stay affordable for a really long period of time, that's going to deliver the kinds of services on site that we know that you need. And so we approached it, our foundation, and me probably more than my boss, approached it from a somewhat skeptical, like, how do we balance, hard lessons learned with innovation? And where we ended up supporting, and we've had a really great experience with a team of 3 developers, including Mercy Housing, is in trying to do ruthless standardization. Like, I've watched these developers sit around and argue about the last 20 square feet in a unit and how much do you need to be 320 versus 300 square feet. Sharing, among 3 developers their skills. One is going to provide, all the services. One is going to provide architectural work, et cetera. And then using modular development in a really smart way, and trying to solve some of the financing problems that come out of that. We had an experience last week where the developers are working on their agreement with the city, which is very time sensitive. And so they started outlining all of the steps that the city would, if we submit our plans to you, you get these many days for us to stay on schedule. And after a while, I said, you could hand this to any smart young UCLA student. He could learn how to do development from this list, because this is so detailed. But it really called out that we've made this so complicated. And so when we submit that list to the city, it's going to be, I think, eye-opening for every council member that we talk to. And how do we streamline that down? But so it's really, how do you, I maybe don't totally agree with Rob that we need 1,000-unit solutions, because I think LA in general is a 12 to 50 to 100 unit sort of community. And how do we come up with something that you can replicate over and over and over again even if it is 100 units at a time, and end up with the 80,000 units that we need.
Yeah, I'm with you, Ann. I mean, the TOC program has been a phenomenal program. We have 23,000 units permitted. We've built over 7,500, and of that, we, I think, have 15% affordable within that platform portfolio. So very effective, and those are all two-year cycle projects. So.
And Ann, I'm not proposing 1,000 units. With the 800 units, what we had proposed was 8 different projects with 100 people each. And I agree, we need to make sure that these properties fit within the communities. But what they do need to do is these buildings would be very repetitive, very similar. Architectural fees I can speak to. You know, for the first one or two, but would come down, you know, considerably because there's repetition. And if you look in 5 Points is here, if you walked up to 5 Points and said you're going to do 1,000 homes, are you going to issue 1,000 RFPs and hire 1,000 architects and hire 1,000 contractors and go approach it this way? They'd tell you they'd be bankrupt in a second. And so again, we've got to change this process. We've got to get repetition. We've got to look at it from a bigger picture so that we can truly buy things down. And then we got to make sure that when we learn, right, if you do 2 and 3 projects, you're going to learn things. And how do you keep that team together to actually do it smarter and better and faster? And
Doug, share your thought, Doug. You've got that.
I was just sitting here thinking to myself, like, if there was one thing that could drive you to drink, it would really be trying to understand how to develop affordable housing. So it's the closest thing to rocket science that I will ever do. And I think part of what it is, so Rob, I agree with both you and Ann. So we are trying really hard to kind of get that replication. We got 400 units of modular in development in San Francisco, working with a boat and LA Family Housing here on the same thing. And I do think we can get those costs down to a level that is reasonable for what we're trying to do and repeat it. I think part of what is hard to appreciate if you're in the private sector is the degree to which there is no affordable housing developer that knows where the money for their next project is going to come from. Right. Because we distribute the money in this incredibly arcane and stupid way. I'm sorry, I was in government. I'm just going to say I was part of that. So but I think the problem is like if you really want to mass produce something, you have to know that you're going to be able to do the 10th and 11th project, and none of us know that. And so that is part of what needs to change.
But why don't we?
Well, let me just say this. I think the thing that LA did really well, and maybe you don't appreciate because you're too close to it, is the degree to which the approach here became as close to plug and play as I think exists in the state. If you go to most parts of California, we work in about 15 different counties, and you try and do supportive housing, you go from one agency to another, desperately trying to piece the things together. And LA is as close to an Apple store as you can get. You walk in, and you really have a better way to get all the pieces together than almost any other place in the state. It doesn't feel like that, but it really is. And I think one of the things that's really important from an innovation perspective is if you tell a developer, here's your operating subsidy and here's your service subsidy, now go out and figure out how to build it, you will get a ton of innovation. What is not happening for most of us is that you're saying, you have those 2 things, and now I want to tell you the 32 different rules that affect how I want you to develop that housing, right? Get out of the way. We all want this, right? Get out of the way. Tell me how much money you're going to give me, and let me figure out how to do it. And whether it's converting a motel or doing modular or whatever it is, there's a ton of innovative spirit out there, but we're in an overregulated space. And I think that's to the earlier point, which is give us a very few ground rules, and then let's try and figure out how to get rid of some of the sacred cows that are stopping us from moving forward.
Let the supervisor then answer.
Well, I mean, I think the good news, again, I go back to Santiago's legislation. I think now the elephant in the room is out that we need to revise the rules as it relates to housing and building and all that. And you're absolutely right in terms of that is now used as a way to impede development. There is no question that government is not good at this. And I know my background is health and welfare, so mental health. When I hear Sarah talk, this is where my passion is, and I really do think root cause of homelessness on many levels. 78%, I think the UCLA study showed. And to your point, either they were mentally ill when they hit the street or they self-medicate on the street. But design build is what the county began to do, and we saved umpteen amounts of dollars in allowing here's how much we're going to pay, build it.
Right.
And it worked. So I completely agree with both of you in terms of thinking outside the box. And that's why, again, on Tuesday, I'm hoping my colleagues will recognize that we are good at writing the checks, lousy at executing the housing. And I am all in to work with the private sector to do more of a long-term, not just episodic building, and working with our partners out there and not setting criteria saying, we know what we need. And, you know, I'm looking at the sites in the 5th District and going to work with my cities, but I want to be flexible in terms of letting the private sector drive that part of the discussion and work toward that. And then we've got a concierge service in LA County right now where we are streamlining the building process, not for 5 Points and Centennial, but for the type of projects we're talking about.
Excellent.
Sorry, McWilliams.
Ann, you had a...
So I just wanted to postscript Doug a little bit, but the blessing and the curse of having done this for a really long time is I have seen us go through seasons of approaches. And in the 80s and 70s, we tended to, sort of, it was like lease the car, pay as you go. We'll give you, a little bit of capital and a lot of operating subsidy. And when that expires, we're dealing with the thousands of units in LA County that are about to become unaffordable because they've gotten to an end of a too short restriction period. The one thing I would say to just give us the money and let us run with it is, if when the controller's audit came out in LA City about HHH and they said, good Lord, $600,000 a unit, which by the way was only one project and it was a tiny project and et cetera, but good Lord, $600,000 a unit, you could pay rent in a motel. And I'm like, yeah, and you know what? At the end of 13 years, you would have spent all $600,000 and you'd have a bunch of receipts. At the end of 13 years of putting $150,000 of HHH money in, you have another, I can't do math in my head real easy, 48 years of affordability left on your 55-year deed restriction. So we need to be clear what we're trying to get to. And so yes, give Doug $150,000 or $200,000, but if you only want him to deliver something for 15 years, he'll come up with different solutions than if you want it to be for a generation.
And it's interesting to me in a room like this that we don't have more empathy for each other. This is a fascinating room because we have.
I love him.
We all love each other here.
I feel the love.
Yeah. But in terms of, I think, out there, let's go out there then. In terms of market rate developers and supportive housing and affordable developers. Because I've been in rooms where people lament the luxury housing outside, and I've been in other rooms where people lament the very expensive supportive housing. And the issue underlying both is exactly the same, right? So just to put a pin on everything said, the reason expensive condos are being built is that's the only thing that pencils out in a regulatory environment worth the investment. So it's the exact same thing we're talking about. If we spent more time kind of advocating together, problem solving together, I think we can go further.
No, I mean, your point's well taken, Chris, and we didn't even get into the middle market. I mean, we could talk forever about it. I mean, our affordable housing is designed to 40 and 60 and 80% of AMI. The middle market out there, as the McKinsey report showed, again, there's 1 million people one paycheck away from not being able to afford a market rate unit here in Los Angeles County. So our issue is, again, housing production. And I think I'd like just a closing thought from each of you very briefly, because we're getting to the end of the panel, as to what your thought is that how do we break the mold? Because this is an emergency, and the regulatory environment creates huge issues for us. We're all empathetic for everybody on the street. I think, Chris, we all share your view, and the same as Sarah, and all of us experience it. We've all know people that are homeless. We experience it every day in our daily life, and we all want to see the problem solved, because a society like ours and a city like ours shouldn't have people living on the streets. I mean, that's just a fact. And so, Doug, I'll start down there with you.
Well, I was just going to go off of Chris's comment about empathy. So I worked in government, and it is an unforgiving environment for mistakes. Like, I think we need to be empathetic to our public officials and the people that work in government, and just say, if we want you to take risks, every once in a while something's not going to work out, and we're not going to crucify you when it doesn't. So
that's good.
I was really excited this year by AB 1197, Assemblymember Santiago's bill, which fully exempted from the California Environmental Quality Act all HHH-funded projects in the city, plus the city's supportive housing zoning ordinance. I mean, I actually worked with his wife, and she told me he got a call from a group up in Northern California that wanted to honor him, and he said, great, but why? Because it does not apply outside the county of LA. And they said, you give us hope, and that gives me hope that we could expand that exemption for other affordable housing projects across the region, across the state, because I agree with Supervisor, the intention behind the California Environmental Quality Act was very good, but it has become weaponized to the point where it is doing so much harm to affordable housing.
I would say the greatest difficulty about ending homelessness is the belief that it's possible. And I would apply that in terms of the emergency to the affordability crisis too. And we kind of skip past it, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that we feel like it's so fatalistic. I think the biggest contribution of the McKinsey report is that it breaks it down into manageable chunks and shows how it is actually possible to get to 500,000 units in less than 10 years in a variety of ways. So I think if we take that spirit and really get behind that, I don't think we have to accept the fact that this other crisis of 150 people coming in to homelessness a day is something that we will just accept.
I believe in the empathy, but if what you've seen today is what I would call creative tension, I think that's a really good thing. And I think it's so important that the private sector play a heavy role with the public sector, and we need to question each other because we really do approach problems different. And I'm not saying the private sector's right, and I'm not saying the public sector's wrong, but it is that tension, it is that pushing and shoving, and we cannot be afraid to question, to push, to shove, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this. Business as usual is not working. So let's work together. Let's make it happen. And we will solve it.
Do it.
Sarah?
I'm really repeating what others have said, but I don't, I think we have to move off of blame. And not just being optimistic that it can be solved. I'm just fed up that this is what we are going to do. I think it's good to be fed up. And I think I completely embrace anyone who's fed up with anything in relationship to this. But I want to caution against blame, because I think that is just leads us to act out of fear or make short-term decisions. And I really think what we need to look more at is that tension that you described, is being able to be humble in a room. And I'm going to mimic my cohort on the commission who always says, well, look in the mirror. Just look in the mirror. You want the answer? Just look in the mirror. So, because it's going to take all of us, and we need new voices in this to really be able to take this to the scale that's needed. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Well, I think, and I say I'm only one of five, but as a board, we have collectively been 100% behind this, even on Measure H when it passed. So I think we all look at it from a different way. And I think I really was trying to boil the ocean and cure homelessness. And I'm now of the opinion, and again, that's why Janice and I are doing this on Tuesday, that we need to focus on what we can focus on, but we also need to articulate what we're doing to the communities, because people do not feel like things are getting done. I think all roads do lead back to the fact that people identify the homeless as those that are on the street that are mentally ill right now. So if we don't address the mental health component of homelessness, when Measure H goes away, they are going to blame us. They're going to say we did nothing.
Yep.
Nothing.
Yep.
And so I'm working with Steinberg up in Sacramento on doing a deep dive on LPS, Lanterman Petra Short, to see if there's ways that it needs to be changed. We're working with Galley, and thank you, Governor Newsom, for agreeing to allow IMD expansion so we can actually expand the number of mental health beds so that there's capacity in hospitals that there currently is not to stabilize these individuals that need to be stabilized and then housed. So I am optimistic. I'm passionate. I take criticism really well, and I'll be the first to tell you that I've had epic fails as supervisor, but I had epic fails as a staffer. I think what will define how I lead is when I take those epic fails and put them to work so that I can make my outcome better moving forward. So, you know, I'm not perfect. The LA Times has pointed it out really well about each and every one of them. But I look in the mirror.
There you go. Thank you. We all look in the mirror, and we have in the program, I think we have the LABC. We had 5 specific ideas that we're behind that we think is achievable, that will help build the mountain. And it is a mountain that we have to build, but it's a first step for us, and it's one of the focuses that we will have as an organization. In closing, I'd just like to say 2 things. One, each and every one of you out there need to get engaged. These people up here make a difference in our life, make a difference in our world, and they're doing great things. And each and every one of us need to get involved because that's what it requires. You know, this is really a village for us to address and solve this problem. And if you're not engaged, please do get engaged because we all need you to make the difference to really solve and address this issue. In closing, please thank this wonderful panel.